Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I'm going to talk to you about the restoration of the parish church in Wymeswold, North Leicestershire. The restoration was done by famous architect Pugin, and at the time it was a bit radical. In fact, by some he was regarded as having vandalised the interior of the church. But if you walk into the church now, you'll see what, in most respects, a very typical English parish church. Perhaps, if anything, it's just a bit too all of a piece, and not sort of a little bit of this and a bit of that is more typical of parish churches. We've got rows of pews, we've got chancel arch, and beyond there is the altar table, communion rail. All very straightforward. There we go, they're walking on the left-hand side. We don't have any illustrations of the interior of Wymeswold Church before the restoration, but we do have an account written in 1835. And according to that, the chancel was devoted to the girls' Sunday school. The space within the communion rails was given over to parish meetings. So in that area, connected in every Christian's mind with the most holy rite of his religion, sounded the obscene brawls and blasphemous oaths of the village farmers. And at those rails was the weekly mockery called Paying the Poor enacted. The church was lighted by tallow dips stuck on sticks which were inserted in holes bored in the top rails of the pews. These were usually in all progressive stages of filth and leaning all ways. The general effect of the inside of the church was completed by two huge interior porches of unpainted deal after the manner of bathing machines, intended to contribute to the warmth of the church, and fitted with two spring doors which at every entrance alarmed the congregation by their loud clap and rebound. So, something was going to change there then, wasn't it? Well, we'll come to that in a few moments. We still have examples of churches which were not restored in the 19th century, and several in Leicestershire. Here we are at Wistow, and we can see, well, what was rather rudely referred to as Protestant boxes. They've got ceilings, plaster ceilings, decorated ceilings. They've got box pews. Not much space at the east end for the communion table, and that's about all you were going to squeeze in. Wistow has got this organ at the northwest end of the nave. Very simple. The exterior looks a bit odd because, of course, this flat roof, even though the building was originally erected with a pitched roof. The buildings like this were actually being built in the late 18th century. Here we are at Stapleford, just to the east of Melton Mowbray. That looks sort of fairly straightforward from the outside, but inside, another of these Protestant boxes, this time with collegiate-style seating. People are actually facing each other rather than towards the east end. At the west end, we have a gallery. This would have been for the musicians in the days before pipe organs and so forth. Very pleasant interior, but certainly not a typical English parish church. A couple of villages away from Stapleford, there's a similar interior in the church at T. And I suppose the best of the Leicestershire examples of this sort of neoclassical style is King's Norton. We've got a fairly good idea about what the state of Leicestershire churches was like at the end of the 18th century. This is because of a series of books written by John Nichols, called The History and Antiquity of the County of Leicester, and he commissioned an artist to illustrate every parish church in Leicestershire. And we see them in various states of disrepair. Here we are at Elmsthorpe. The nave has lost its roof quite clearly some time ago, and there isn't a chancel at all. Since that illustration was made, they built a new chancel, and that's where the services take place now, but the nave still has no roof. The village of Gloucester, well, possibly the nave's got a roof on it, but one hell of a structural crack down at the west end. Nichols shows this illustration of what he calls Norston. We know it as Nossington. Looks like the nave hasn't got a roof. Here we are at Old Dolby as we know it, Dolby on the Wolds, as it used to be known. Again, very clearly the nave without a roof here. Nichols also shows us Wymeswold. This is the only illustration we have before the restoration, which took place about 30 or 40 years after this was drawn. Now, what was going on around this time? Well, around the 1820s, it was recognised that there was a shortage of churches, so there was a commission set up to fund these and build them, and they were known as the commissioners' churches, usually fairly straightforward. One of the examples in Leicestershire is at Donisthorpe. Simple tower, not very big. If we walk round to the east end, we can see there isn't really a chancel, it's just almost like a recess big enough to take the communion table. Inside we would have had pretty much those Protestant boxes that you saw in earlier photographs. Now this didn't go down very well at the time because there was actually a movement to try and get medieval liturgy back into the Church of England. Now that was radical in its own right because everybody accused them of going Catholic, the Anglo-Catholic movement, and the smells and bells, as it was derogatorily termed. So it's known as the Tractarian movement, also known as the Oxford movement, but a group of students in Cambridge set up the Cambridge Camden Society specifically to promote a revival of medieval Gothic architecture. They produced a number of publications. This is one called Contrasts, and it does what it says. It shows a neoclassical church and then an idealised Gothic Revival church. I mean, it has to be said, they chose perhaps one of the worst examples of a neoclassical design to contrast with the idealised Gothic Revival. It's pretty radical stuff because in the 1820s, if you mentioned the Gothic, it was badly regarded, and it was brought to mind things like the Strawberry Hill Gothic, a sort of dandy palace that Horace Walpole had a hand in, and definitely not the sort of style of architecture you should be thinking about for something as august as the parish church. Nevertheless, it started to catch on, and some of the ideas of the Camden Society were brought into play when Appleby Magna Church was restored around 1830. It's the first of the Leicestershire churches to be influenced by the Gothic Revival. The exterior, fairly plain bit of Gothic, nothing really changed from the original medieval structure, but inside still got box pews, which was the tradition, but a lot of detailing in the nave and the ceiling there have been taken from the Camden Society publications. Not quite fitting the bill because turn around and look at the West End, and there's this gallery for the musicians, but it's a very large West Gallery. In fact, it wouldn't look out of place in a 1920s cinema. A few years later, Countersthorpe Church was restored quite heavily. Again, quite transitional because we have brick surrounds to the sort of Gothic style windows. Now this really didn't fit in with the some of the ideals of the Camden Society, and not followed in any other churches. Another transitional church in the southwest of Leicestershire, Norton Juxta Twycross. Nice little timber roof there. Perhaps the timbers are a bit too slender to sort of really pull off the medieval effect, but and again, notice the box pews, so not quite as things sort of were recommended. But the exterior is very pleasant. We also had an early example of the Gothic Revival at Chilcot in 1842, but we're not quite sure what's original, what was replaced later in 1885. But somewhere into this mix comes the restoration of St Mary's at Wymeswold, and this is quite pivotal for North Leicestershire and for the region. And the reason is because the architect was Pugin. Pugin was born in London in 1812. He wasn't a particularly good scholar, but he did have some incredible artistic skills, and he set off at the age of 14 to go around Europe drawing the churches and cathedrals. He was deeply influenced by this, and at the age of 23 he converted to Catholicism. Well, that was pretty radical at the time because it's only 6 years after the Catholic Emancipation Act. Before that it would have been illegal to be a Catholic in England. So here we are, age of 23, converted to Catholicism, and his artistic work was spotted by Lord Shrewsbury, and he got briefly involved in redesigning Alton Towers for Lord Shrewsbury. This led to an introduction to the president of Oscott College near Birmingham, and Pugin was recruited to teach ecclesiastical art and antiquities. And because he was in Birmingham, he met the Catholic bishop for Birmingham, Thomas Walsh, and was invited to design the Catholic cathedral there, St Chad's. Pugin was to go on to design 6 cathedrals and about 40 churches, and quite a number of private houses as well. One of the other cathedrals is in Nottingham, St Barnabas. He really came to fame when he was recruited by Charles Barry to assist him with the rebuilding of the Houses of Commons after the disastrous fire. Pugin produced thousands of drawings for every aspect of the details of the interiors and the furnishing and so forth. His hand is everywhere, and even the hands of Big Ben were originally designed by Pugin, and the numerals around it. Here we are with a floral design to go in the House of Lords library, some wallpaper, tiles. He just loved designing tiles. We'll see more of this a little later. And brass door fittings. A whole entrance to the robing room, superb grandeur, deep reds and gold. It's impressive stuff. The Royal Gallery, the canopy above the throne in the Lord's Chamber, part of the Royal Gallery. All these were drawn by him and sent off to the different craftsmen to make according to his designs. Fireplaces, figures alongside. Mass-produced they were, and we'll work out how these figures were mass-produced a little later. Towards the end of his relatively short life, he was commissioned to produce a Catholic church for Cheadle in Staffordshire, Church of St Giles, and it is completely over the top. It's a wonderful experience to walk inside there. Everything is gilt and Minton tiles. It really is just mind-blowing. But prior to that, it started work on a completely different type of church for Mount St Bernard, the first monastery to be built in England after the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century. Now I have to be careful here because the work at Mount St Bernard proceeded quite slowly, and most of what you see there was designed after Pugin died. There's a small Catholic chapel in Shepshed, St Winifred's, now converted to a house, and Wymeswold. This is the interior, taken around the early years of the 20th century. One of the few Church of England places of worship which he had a hand in. And all the details, again, designed by Pugin, including some sconces that had been removed at some point, probably in the 1950s, and were found in a rather corroded state in the boiler house. They were rescued and restored at the instigation of Isabel Foster, and in 1997 they were put back up and occasionally have been lit for services. So they were designed by Pugin, as was the cover of a Bible, which is still in the church, along with a coffin bier. Among the other things, he put the organ into a little recess on the north side of the chancel. A fairly normal place, you'd think, to put an organ, but actually, so far as we're aware, this is the first time that anybody had built a little recess for an organ at the side of the chancel anywhere in the country. Why did it all happen? Well, that's because of another significant figure at the time, the Reverend Henry Alford. After he left Wymeswold, he went on to become Dean of Canterbury. He was one of the few people in Leicestershire who was a member of the Cambridge Camden Society. We don't know quite how he met Pugin. Here's a photograph of Alford that we think was taken during the years he was vicar at Wymeswold. Alford was very keen for the work at Wymeswold to set fashion, if you like, to be trend-setting, and he paid for this publication, describing with lots of illustrations exactly what had gone on at Wymeswold. It's published anonymously, but with every reason to believe that it was actually a work of Dean Alford, or at his instigation. Certainly, by the time Wymeswold Church had been reconsecrated, a similar restoration project was underway at Anstey. This was by the local building company of Broadbent and Hawley, but they were certainly inspired in many of the details by Pugin's designs at Wymeswold. We know a lot about the Victorian restorations in Leicestershire because of the very thorough work of Geoffrey Brandwood, in a book that was published in 2002 called Bringing Them to Their Knees. And from that research he was able to establish just how many churches were being restored in the neo-Gothic style in the middle of the 19th century. The real peak around 1860s, 1870s. Here we are, about a dozen churches a year being restored at any one time then. They were all being restored in the Gothic Revival style, which is pretty remarkable because in the 1830s it was really rather radical. And it's only because of Pugin's influence that it became the accepted thing. Clearly, if this style of architecture was good enough for the House of Commons, then it was good enough for the town hall, and it was good enough for the parish church. And the type of liturgy that went with these churches was clearly the direction in which the Church of England moved during that time, and the 18th century fashion for a lot of sermons and not a lot of hymns was a thing of the past. Pugin's original work included some written biblical texts, both around the chancel arch and behind the altar. Now, these were painted on the plaster, and sadly the plaster failed, and by the 1950s was removed. We actually have letters written a few years later by the vicar at the time, who was Lawrence Jackson, explaining just what he'd done to at that time. I'll let you sort of read through at your own pace. It's in the nature of parish churches that they need regular repairs and restorations. And in the spring of 2004, there was another fairly major restoration of St Mary's in Wymeswold. One of the problems was the stained glass had not really been maintained since it was installed by Pugin. So the team of people responsible for the restoration asked one of the leading stained glass restoration studios in the country, John Hardman Studios, to come and look at our stained glass and tell us what needed to be done, and quite clearly how much it was going to cost. And two of the directors of John Hardman Studios arrived at St Mary's, and well, I was there, and frankly they just went silent. They wandered around, and I think, well, my thought was that, my goodness, this is going to be very expensive. And when they did speak, they were ecstatic. They were some of the first stained glass windows that the company had ever produced. Nearly all of them to designs by Pugin himself, and not only that, they were in, generally, a very good state of preservation, remarkably so in some cases. So the sheer number of Pugin windows at Wymeswold actually makes it unique. The nearest competition is another St Mary's over at Westhofts in Norfolk, but Wymeswold has more Pugin windows. Why did John Hardman Studios get involved in making stained glass? Well, there's a story there as well. Pugin had met John Hardman when he was working on St Chad's Cathedral in Birmingham, his first major commission, and Hardman at that time was a metal button and medal manufacturer in the jewellery quarter. He was also a devout Catholic, and only a year older than Pugin himself. What Hardman brought was the ability to effectively mass produce all the metalwork that was needed inside these churches. These sort of lecterns, the candelabra or the coronae, and so forth and so forth. And in fact, St Chad's still has a large number of these early Hardman works. So Hardman was producing the metalwork, and Pugin at that time was commissioning stained glass from William Wales up in Newcastle on Tyne. But Pugin wasn't very happy with the work that Wales was doing. He regarded it as a bit too plain and mechanical. And then Wales wasn't that happy with Pugin because Pugin was always wanting to haggle down the price. So the outcome was that there's a letter from Pugin to John Hardman written in February 1845, which reads, "I'm scheming a stained glass shop, but this only between ourselves." And indeed, John Hardman Studios did enter stained glass production, and as I said, some of their first work is here at St Mary's in Wymeswold, and it's very splendid. Nothing novice about what we're looking at here. This photograph was taken when a group of people from Wymeswold visited John Hardman's studios around 2004-2005, at the time when some of the windows from St Mary's were being restored in their workshops. The oldest of the windows in Wymeswold is 3-light window in the south side of the aisle near the baptistry area. This we know was produced on the 15th of December 1845, because the John Hardman Studios records of work, their day books, have been retained and are in the library at Birmingham. The Camden Society's journal, The Ecclesiologist, reported that the designs in the north and south windows of the Chancellor of Wymeswold were to designs by John Hardman Powell. Now, John Hardman Powell was actually the nephew of John Hardman, but became Pugin's student. He was about 15 years younger than Pugin. So, although at the time Pugin restored St Mary's at Wymeswold, it would have been very radical. Within 20 or 30 years, it had just become the done thing, the way that you did parish churches.